Well, good day, everyone. Welcome, and thank you for joining today's edition of Teneo Insights. I'm Kevin Kajiwara in New York City. John Brennan is with me today. He served as the director of the Central Intelligence Agency during the second Obama administration, taking over from General David Petraeus and then handing it over to Mike Pompeo when the Trump administration came in. While director, his deputy was Avril Haines, who today is the director of national intelligence. John spent much of his career at CIA. Among other roles he had there, he was the station chief in Saudi Arabia. He was the daily intelligence briefer to President Clinton, the first director of the National Counterterrorism Center under President George W. Bush, and he established the Directorate for Digital Innovation. And from 2009 until 2013, he served the Obama administration as the Deputy National Security Advisor and Assistant to the President for Homeland Security and Counterterrorism. He is the author of the New York Times best-selling memoir, Undaunted, My Fight Against America's Enemies at Home and Abroad. Today, he is a principal with Teneo's strategic partner firm, WestExec Advisors. So, Director Brennan, thank you very much for being with us today. So, John, I want to start here. Here we are. It's December. It's a natural time to kind of reflect on what has happened this year and where we are and what we should be concerned with as we look forward into next year. So maybe before we start drilling down just some of the specific issues of Russia and China, et cetera, maybe your sort of top down or big picture reflections on where we are. It's been a very, very complicated year, and there are a lot of risks and potential opportunities swirling around out there, as you and I were just discussing in the green room. So how do you see the world at the moment?
Well, Kevin, first of all, thanks for the invitation to talk with you this morning. Yeah, over the past year, I've done a fair amount of traveling, both here in the United States as well as abroad, as maybe some of the concerns about COVID are receding. I've had the opportunity to talk to a lot of folks, and the words that I'm hearing from people about that global landscape, words like dynamic, unsettled, uncertain, transitional. I think they see that there are just so many things that are going on globally that they really don't have a good sense of where things are going in the future, given that we have such disruptive events such as Russia's invasion of Ukraine, developments inside of China and between the United States and China, that global landscape is rather unsettled. And so what a lot of individuals are looking at is what's going to be sort of the future, how is the current developments going to really affect whether or not you're in government or you're in private business, private sector, even academia. How is the new world of the future going to affect the equities, the interests, and as you point out, what are going to be the challenges and the opportunities, given that not only unsettled, but there's a confluence of so many developments that affect one another. So I think people are trying to get a sense of how we're going to see things evolve in the coming years that's going to, again, affect their ability to navigate what I think are kind of very challenging shoals that are out there. And so one of the things that when I was back at the CIA, what we try to do is not look in the rearview mirror in terms of how to deal with the challenges of the past, but how to anticipate the changes of the future, particularly since technology has had such a profound impact on our lives and the global landscape. Looking at the challenges that democracies are facing these days, and as well as the challenges that authoritarian regimes are facing. So again, there's this general sense of, in many respects, unease, because of the very unsettled global landscape.
When I speak to CEOs and others in the C-suite, one of the things that's very clear, and this kind of goes to the exact point that you were making, but I want to ask you how it's impacting, in your sense, the U.S. government as well, and the White House ultimately, right? Which is this confluence of events that are sort of unprecedented in history in terms of them happening all at once, right? So this kind of questioning of what role the United States is going to play and what that is going to mean for the global order, the global system, globalization, essentially the operating environment that most CEOs came of age understanding that they were going to be involved in, the rise of China and how that's going to impact global operating environment, and whether China is actually peaked as a global power unto itself. Climate change, the sort of the existential element of that, but coupled with the complex risks and opportunities, quite frankly, that come along with the transition to a sustainable, greener energy future. And then, of course, the disruption of technology that you're talking about, not in terms of the next device that's going to be created, but this sort of fundamental alteration of the nature of societal and governmental relations and the like. And so a lot of CEOs sit there saying, there's no blueprint for how to deal with this. But that also has to be true in the intelligence community and at the White House as well. So nobody really has an answer here, yeah?
Yeah, and there have been so many discontinuities recently. And by that I mean, when I look at Western democracies, the United States being a prime example, there is such a polarization internally in these countries that's being reflected in the governments that are being elected and their policies. And so I think that there is concern globally about how there has been whipsawing between administrations. We looked at the Obama administration, and they forged the Iranian nuclear deal, the Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action, joined the Paris Climate Accords, moving forward with the Trans-Pacific Partnership, only to have the Trump administration tear up the Iranian nuclear deal, withdraw from the Paris Climate Accords as well as the TPP and other things. And so I think there's a concern that depending on how politics in these liberal democratic societies go, that you can have this whipsawing back and forth. We've also seen it in other countries where, like for example, in Colombia and Brazil, you go from left-leaning governments to right-leaning governments as a result of the electoral processes. So it's in many respects the messiness of democracy that again is manifesting itself in these discontinuities, not just in their foreign policies, but also in their domestic policies. And I do think those actors on the world stage, whether they be governments or private sector companies, they wonder about what's going to be the next twist, what's going to be the next change in direction. And so I, as you point out, I think there is this so much that is going on that it's difficult to plan, and that's why I do think it's important to be able to not anticipate the next change, but be able to be positioned so that you can adapt to those changes. It's one of the things when I was at CIA, basically overhauled the organizational structure of the CIA in order to be able to adapt readily and quickly to changes and disruptions in that global arena. And I do think that's the key as we look forward because of the potential for disruptions, for new developments. And those entities, governments, corporations that have that adaptability, I think they're the ones who are going to be able to best deal with these changes that are inevitable.
Now, I don't want to put words in your mouth, but it seems to be implying that there's this concern. It's difficult to plan ahead if there's this whipsawing of policy as democracies swing from one end of the political spectrum to the other, that there's some more constancy, at least in terms of policy visibility and direction of travel from an autocratic state such as China. But having said that, execution risk, just because this is the plan, their ability to execute is obviously questionable. But it does seem that just in the last couple of days on the China front, as you've seen these sort of large-scale protests that have excited much of the world, and you've seen this subtle but very unmistakable shift on their zero COVID policy just in the last couple of days. And so, as recently as the 20th Party Congress, I mean, they continued to double down on the policy, and then they won't say that this is in response to the protests, that it's all part of the 20-part plan and so on. There's enough ambiguity in their stated policies that they can justify a lot of these maneuvers. But it's impossible to watch what's happened and think, that there wasn't some sort of pressure that they are now responding to. But how do you see this point though, that autocracies have got a state, or at least in China's case, a very stated direction of travel, stated objectives that they want to achieve by certain milestone dates, but the risk then becomes the execution side of that.
Yeah, well, I think it's been the selling point that Xi Jinping and even Vladimir Putin and others have made, that you can count on these authoritarian systems because you're not going to have that whipsawing between administrations. Xi Jinping, over the last 10 years with the Belt and Road Initiative, I think he's been able to say that Beijing is going to continue on this trajectory because of the stranglehold that the Communist Party has on the government, on the economy, and on the future direction of China. And same thing with Vladimir Putin when he pointed out that the United States, is not a reliable ally. We're going to curry favor with certain governments for an administration, but then the next administration is going to change course dramatically. But when you point out in authoritarian systems, you don't have the ability to vent the concerns that you have in a liberal democratic society with elections and politics and all of that messiness. But what we're seeing in China now is this dissatisfaction that is going on after a generation of tremendous economic growth and development, where they're used to high levels of GDP increases. And now, because of COVID and because of some more repressive policies on the part of Xi Jinping, I think there is this dissatisfaction that I think is rooted in economic concerns because of the disruptions that these COVID policies and others have caused, but also a sense that the government is not being responsive to the needs of the Chinese people. Now, there's some questions about how much this is going to actually influence Xi Jinping's domestic approach, as well as will it manifest itself in any way in terms of China's foreign policy. But I do think that that argument that authoritarian regimes are able to maintain a constant and consistent direction is true to some extent because they do have this monopoly on power. But at the same time, authoritarian regimes and systems are not invulnerable. They are vulnerable to the pressures that can be developed internally that can, in fact, affect not just the domestic policies of these regimes, but also their ability to operate on that global stage.
So let's stay with China for a couple minutes here. I guess one question that that comes up here is, well, just going back to what you were saying for one moment. Media is making a big deal of the fact that these protests were sort of the largest in terms of total numbers since the Tiananmen era. But I think we should be very clear, right, that China has spent the better part of the last 20 plus years establishing a very, very effective surveillance and security state. So I just want to make the audience understand where you stand on the stability of the Xi regime, even in the light of these types of protests.
Yeah, I do think that Xi Jinping is very much in control, not only because of the repressive security system that he has in place and the surveillance capabilities, but also as a result of the last Party Congress, he has put in place sycophants and people who are going to remain loyal to him. So I don't think there's going to be a fracturing at all of the upper political hierarchy in Beijing. At the same time, I think Xi Jinping is a careful and strategic thinker. I don't think he's going to try to overreact to this, and he's going to, I think, try to suppress these demonstrations so they don't get out of hand. And they are they're spontaneous. There's not any type of leadership at this point. And it took the trigger of the reaction to the COVID protocols, but also the fire that developed that's really, because of COVID, they weren't able to respond quickly and led to a number of deaths. And I do see similarities to what happened with Tiananmen, which is that a lot of the younger generation is coming out. I think they feel more energized. But the Chinese government back in Tiananmen, those protests went on for about 6 weeks before they really cracked down. And I do think they were trying to contain it. I do think that in this digital era, sometimes this may be more difficult for a government to suppress things without the video footage that makes its way onto social media. At the same time, the Chinese government has tremendous technological capabilities. The security services are ubiquitous and large. But I do think that there is still the potential for these types of demonstrations to put additional pressure on Xi Jinping that's going to lead him to maybe even relax more than he would like at this point some of these restrictions that he has placed on the country domestically.
You know, you just said that Xi Jinping is known to be a very careful and strategic thinker. At the same time, referring to the 20th Party Congress that recently ended, you spoke about him packing the standing committee and Politburo with loyalists and even sycophants. And so I'm wondering if you think there's always been this issue that autocrats over time become the quality of decision making, let alone the quality of the decisions themselves, but the quality that goes into the decision making deteriorates over time because they get surrounded by a smaller and smaller group of yes men. Putin comes to power in 2000, and there's a lot of economic liberals and reformists around. You can't find any of these people around him today. But China seemed to have threaded the needle in a sense by having this renewal of the leadership that was sort of put in place by Deng Xiaoping, the 10-year cycles. You knew who the successor was going to be, etc. Xi Jinping has just wiped that all off the table. Are you concerned that as strategic and intelligent as Xi Jinping is and what a plan he's got, that quality of decision making around him and with him himself is going to deteriorate over time given the structure of his leadership cadre?
Yeah, so it's a very good point, and I very much agree that leaders who are in place for an extended period of time, particularly those that have been able to shape the government or their leadership team, tend to become overconfident in terms of their ability to navigate the challenges ahead of them. I think Xi Jinping was very careful of the last 10 years, taking the steps necessary in order to consolidate his domestic position as well as to expand China's global reach. And the same thing, as you point out, with Putin. But at some point, a number of these leaders, again, overreach, and they go beyond what their capabilities are. And I do think sometimes their ambitions get ahead of the capabilities. And because they tend to be sometimes in a groupthink mentality where they basically determine exactly what the thinking is, their prism is skewed and distorted. And I wouldn't say it's just limited to government leaders. I've seen it also in companies and corporations, where if a leader becomes too comfortable and too confident, they don't take into account some of the changes in that broader ecosystem that they need to be able to address. That some of the capabilities as well as the strategies that they employed for their first 10 or 20 years are no longer as effective because the ecosystem has changed, but they've failed to take that into account. So it is going to be interesting to see how Xi Jinping, coming off of the Party Congress, having another 5 years that he's assured, is he going to recognize that China is still evolving and changing, as is the global landscape? Is he going to use some of those methods and tactics that were very useful and effective for him in his first 10 years? Or is he going to adapt? Again, it comes down to adaptability and recognizing that the future challenges may have similarities to previous challenges, but they always have new dimensions to them. And they need to take into account, what are those new dimensions? How should I respond and react to the new realities? And sometimes the old tried and true methods are no longer going to be as effective as they once were.
So you know as well as I do that earlier this year, after the initial shock and awe of the Russia invasion of Ukraine, and we'll get to Russia here in a moment, but as leaders around the world, business, markets, otherwise, were looking around after this series of crises that hit them to think, what's the next risk to drop? And I think it's inevitable once you have something as big and as seismic as as an invasion of another country, that you're thinking, what's the next country that can be invaded? And so inevitably, we and you fielded a lot of incoming questions with regards to China's intentions on Taiwan and whether that timetable would be accelerated, et cetera. So where do you stand on how you're looking at the China-Taiwan situation, both sort of in the near term, let's call it the next couple of years, versus the longer term, and how you can see that playing out?
Well, the one China policy, from Xi Jinping's perspective, is basically core to what China is. And I think he definitely wants a part of his legacy, a major part of his legacy, to be that while he was the head of government, military, the party, that Taiwan returned or came into the China fold. At the same time, I do not believe that he wants to engage in any type of military assault that is going to lead to, a large destruction of Taiwan. I think he wants to absorb absorb Taiwan because of its tremendous technological prowess. He, I think, realizes that any type of military invasion would be exceptionally costly and bloody. The Taiwanese have formidable capabilities. They would resist. And I think Xi Jinping, looking at what's happened to Ukraine, that despite what Putin might have thought was going to be a quick blitzkrieg operation that was going to take over Ukraine, it was far from what happened. And China's military, although it's big and capable and looks good on paper, it really hasn't been battle tested at all. And the Taiwanese would certainly fight for their homeland. So looking out over the next several years, I could see Xi Jinping doing things to try to test the United States in terms of what does strategic ambiguity when it comes to the defense of Taiwan actually mean. Might he decide to resort to some type of tactic, such as putting in place some type of naval blockade or extending some of these air defense zones or whatever, just to see how the United States is going to react? But I do think he needs to be mindful that the swiftness of the international reaction to Russia's invasion of Ukraine might be a harbinger of some type of reaction to a Chinese aggressive action vis-a-vis Taiwan. And although there's a lot of talk about decoupling China from the international economy, I think he knows that China relies on that international economy and finance system in order to thrive. So again, I guess my bottom line is I think he's going to try to continue to push for the absorption of Taiwan. I think he would like it to be done in a non-military way. Unfortunately, the political winds in Taiwan are not blowing in the direction that he would like. But I do think that we will see some efforts on the part of Xi Jinping to try to, again, test the U.S. position, but also put additional pressure inside of Taiwan to try to get it looking toward China in a more accommodating fashion.
How important do you think that the meeting between President Biden and Xi Jinping was on the sidelines of the G20? I mean, not a lot of headlines coming out of that. I don't think any were expected, but how critical is it just to have that kind of human connection? You have the first in-person meeting between the two of them since President Biden assumed the presidency. But just in terms of establishing the guardrails and perhaps establishing a floor under what has been a deteriorating relationship, do you think something was, or from your observations, was something accomplished at that bilateral?
I think it was critically important. Both these individuals, Xi Jinping and Joe Biden, are steeped in international relations affairs. They understand the global landscape because they've been involved in it for many years. And when I think about Xi Jinping meeting with Donald Trump, Donald Trump had a very, very superficial understanding of a lot of these issues, but Joe Biden certainly has lived them. But also, I think the Biden administration's approach, and it's not just President Biden, but also Jake Sullivan and Tony Blinken and others, they will state their positions strongly, but they're not going to do it in a confrontational manner. And I think what they were trying to convey to Xi Jinping and his team is that that the United States recognizes that the U.S.-China relationship is a complex one. It's a multidimensional one. And we are going to have areas where there's going to be some profound disagreements, and it's going to be contentious. But there are also areas where I think that both countries can find ways to cooperate and to lessen the temperature and tensions that exist. And so I do think those face-to-face meetings are very important as a way to convey, certainly from Washington's perspective, that we're not going to be just have this sort of blunt force pressure against China, despite some of the rhetoric that's coming out of Washington. And so I do think it was important and helpful. I'm not saying that it has been a game changer from the standpoint of a lot of these issues, but I do think it sent a signal of interest in working through some of these issues in a productive and an effective manner.
Do you think that message is adequately being conveyed domestically as well? Because it seems as if the deterioration of relations has translated into a pretty chilling effect in academia, even in some of corporate America, this kind of almost suspicion of all things and all Chinese nationals. And I'm just wondering if we're overdoing that to some degree. I mean, it should come as no surprise that China's got a spy agency just like we do, and spies spy. That's what they do. But is there something more nefarious going on? I mean, putting back on your director of CIA hat on here for a moment, Chinese activities within the United States, and how that's translating to Chinese students, Chinese science professionals, and the like here in the U.S.
Well, make no mistake, I believe that China presents the most serious and sort of long-standing or lasting strategic challenge to the United States, for many of the reasons you say. I mean, they have a very rapacious appetite, not just in the United States, but globally, to try to steal intellectual property, gain access to sensitive research areas. China, I think, aspires to become the predominant world power in just this. So the FBI and the intelligence community have their hands really full because China is just so large, and they can tap into this diaspora that businessmen, academic students, others, organizations, companies, in order to be able to pursue their agendas and objectives. And so therefore, there's also this very strong bipartisan sentiment that China is a challenge and a problem. And so I do think that is seen inside of China, that they know that they are the number sort of one longer term strategic challenge to the United States. But at the same time, I think the fact that the Biden administration now has been rather measured in some of its rhetorical comments about the demonstrations in China, and it's been criticized roundly by a lot of the Republicans. I think that they are trying to walk this line in terms of not trying to be seen as unjustly, unfairly, inappropriately interfering in China's domestic issues, but at the same time, respect for human rights and saying it's legitimate for people to demonstrate. But I think China on so many fronts, and it's on the technological front, it's on the digital front, it's on the trade, commercial, and the military security realms as well. China's strength is formidable, and they're going to leverage those capabilities in order to, again, try to gain advantage vis-a-vis the United States in many parts of the world. That's the whole reason behind the Belt and Road Initiative, be able to put those roots down. But we're not going to be able to resolve a lot of these tensions in U.S.-China relationship easily. But again, I think the Biden administration wants to send a signal that we will compete where we need to, but we're not going to do it just because there's this, anti-China sentiment that seems to be building here in the United States.
So I want to shift gears now and turn to the big geopolitical event of this year, which is obviously the Russian invasion of Ukraine. It's been going on for the better part of 10 months now, and the clear signal has been that Ukraine, thanks to the support of the United States and the Western Alliance, financially, militarily, and of course politically, is quote unquote winning. And they have reclaimed quite a lot of the territory that was originally taken by Russia in the early stages of the invasion. Russia, for its part, is now engaging in missile strikes against critical civilian infrastructure. So how do you see things playing out here as we move into winter, but as we prepare for, frankly, spring and summer next year as well? What's your sense of the state of the war, and therefore, given where we are now, where things can go?
Well, I think the Ukrainians are going to continue to put military pressure on the Russians in the battlefield. They've had the momentum after taking Kharkiv, having the Russians withdraw from Kherson. They have been able to take advantage of the incompetence of the Russian military forces and the leadership there. So I do think they're going to try to continue to prosecute it. It's going to be more difficult in some areas because of the winter months. But I don't think they're going to relent, because I think they do smell, some additional blood. At the same time, I think Russia and Putin realize that, he can't call upon his conventional military forces to reverse their fortunes on the battlefield, because they have demonstrated time and time again that they're not up to the task, which is why he's going after critical infrastructure, civilian targets. He's trying to put the pressure on the Ukrainians to see whether or not it's going to weaken their resolve, and then put some additional domestic political pressure on Zelensky to see whether or not there can be some type of negotiated solution there. And so I do think that Putin has recognized that his ambitions were unrealistic. And I think he's going to try to maintain the foothold that Russia has right now in the southeastern portion of the country, Mariupol, the area that's bordering Crimea, and hoping that there's going to be a war fatigue that will set in, not just in Ukraine, but also in the West and NATO countries. I think he has been disappointed so far that weakening resolve has not become manifest yet in policies. But I think this is going to continue to be a rather protracted conflict that Russia is going to try to utilize, not just these missile strikes against critical infrastructure, electric grids, or other water pumping stations, but also try to make more use of the drones that he's procuring from Iran, try to replenish his missile inventory. I don't think psychologically Putin can acknowledge that this has been a failed policy, failed effort. He's going to try to, I think, retain whatever territory he can there, and see whether or not the coming months will provide maybe some new opportunities for a respite in terms of the drubbing that his military forces have taken.
But when you look at the constellation of leaders and populations in Europe, and as well as domestically here in the U.S., I mean, you make the point that he's been wrong so far with regards to wavering Western resolve and avoiding war fatigue. But going forward, if we head into 2023 with all the other complications of life and other risks that may unfold, and if the war is as hot as it was in 2022, I mean, we're looking at 100,000 casualties plus on both sides at this point. Do you see that fatigue risk there?
Yeah, I do. And when I've traveled to Europe recently, I've talked to some former colleagues and friends, and they are concerned that there could be some wobbly knees on some of the government officials and politicians as the inflationary pressures, recession, other types of economic challenges really complicate that environment. So there is the potential for that to weaken as far as the NATO support. And I think that's one of the reasons why the Ukrainians want to continue to prosecute this war, because as the Ukrainians continue to make progress, as it's not a frozen conflict, I think they feel that that's going to be the best argument to make to NATO countries, the United States, that this support should increase because the Ukrainians are on a roll, and we need to maintain that. I think there's still, some uncertainty about what Putin may try to do in a non-conventional way. I think a lot of the concerns about tactical nuclear weapons has receded a bit, but I would still say that it's on the menu of options for him. Might he decide to go asymmetrically in terms of digital attacks against NATO countries, put some additional pressure internally in the European countries? Was that the explosions of the Nord Stream 1 and 2 pipelines underseas, was that the work of Russia as a way to send a signal to Europe that there are vulnerabilities there? It's not just the undersea pipelines, but also the undersea cables, fiber optic cables. So I think there's still a lot of things that can happen in the coming months that will affect the ultimate trajectory. But at this point, I think Putin is going to continue to try to put that pressure on the Ukrainians as well as on NATO in terms of the pressures associated with maintaining this level of support for the Ukrainian forces. And I think he's hoping, and I think it's unrealistic, that there's going to be a significant weakening of that resolve to support Ukraine. And even though Kevin McCarthy, who's going to probably be the next Speaker of the U.S. House, has said that there's going to be no blank check to Ukraine, there's never been a blank check to Ukraine. And I think he may try to restrain somewhat the Biden administration's support, but I do think the administration is going to be able to count on enough support in Congress to be able to continue to provide support to Ukraine, at least for the foreseeable future.
I wanted to ask you about Iran here as well. So earlier this year, it looked like there was some actually real momentum toward getting back into the nuclear deal, the JCPOA. And then obviously those talks have broken down and there's nothing going on, at least that's overtly being reported on. At the same time, we have seen an unprecedented level of protest in Iran. And then the last point I would make is that, the lesson that Iran must take, just as everyone else does, from the Russia-Ukraine war, is that the United States is reluctant to get into a hot war with a nuclear power. So do not give up your nukes for anything other than the most strategic of deals that could come your way. Where do you see Iran right now? Actually, do you see any wobbling to regime stability with these protests over time? But where do you see the Iran story today?
Well, these are the most significant demonstrations and protests in Iran in many, many years, and I think the unfortunate tragic death of the Iranian Kurdish woman Mehsa while she was detained by Iranian security forces was the spark and the trigger to set these demonstrations off. And frequently in the Middle East, and as well as other parts of the world, it takes that spark if the forest is dry. And the Iranian forest is pretty dry and mainly it's a result in many instances, not just in Iran, other countries, because of economic disenchantment and because of concerns about corruption and because of repression of these authoritarian regimes. The demonstrations, though, have been rather spontaneous. They're driven in large part by a lot of women who have been outraged and by the youth. But the Iranians have resorted to these repressive measures and have killed a lot of Iranians as well as incarcerated many thousands. So I do believe that the Iranian government is not at this point threatened as a result of these demonstrations. I do think it's going to continue to face these challenges because the economic situation in Iran is just so awful. I think it's going to be tested when Supreme Leader Khamenei passes away, because then there's real questions about who's going to replace him. Will it be a supreme leader? That could be, again, another trigger that's going to set off demonstrations. But right now, there's no real leadership in these protests. Unlike in the late 70s, when you had a very formidable Iranian exile group under Ayatollah Khomeini, you don't have that now. There's really no credible exile group or resistance group leadership. So getting back to the Iranian nuclear program, they have enriched uranium at much higher levels than was allowed under the JCPOA. I don't believe that they are at the point of making any decision about developing a nuclear warhead and enriching uranium to weapons grade. That said, I think they still have these stockpiles. I believe that the chances of restarting the JCPOA right now are very, very low, not only because of what's happening inside Iran and the repressive measures that the regime has taken, but also I think the Iranians are unwilling to turn the clock back and to give up what they have done, because they did that once before in terms of destroying their centrifuges and giving up their heavy water and even disabling reactors, only in their minds to be duped by the United States, because they gave all that up and then the United States tore up the agreement. So at this point, I'm not optimistic that we're going to be able to forge that agreement in the near future. But at the same time, I do not believe the Iranians are going to go forward with any breakout scenario, because I think they know that would in fact provoke a very, very adverse reaction on the part of not only the United States, but also the Israelis. And again, at this point, I don't think they're in a position to weather such a reaction.
Going back to what we were talking about at the very beginning about this almost dizzying array of risks that are out there that are challenging to kind of keep an eye on. Over the course of this conversation, we've been talking about the big headline ones: Russia, Ukraine, China, things like Iran. But when you kind of sit back and consider what's on the headlines of the major newspapers and even the think tanks and the like, what do you sit there and think? What, this is what's not on the front pages, or not even in the in the middle of the paper, that we really ought to not lose sight of, that is potentially moving. What kind of keeps you awake at night that's not being particularly well covered out there?
Well, I think there are some issues that are being talked about and covered, but I don't think that there is the type of aggressive action taken to mitigate them that is necessary. And I am somebody who's very concerned about the effects of climate change, what it's going to do as far as rising sea levels and leading to the displacement of populations from coastal communities into urban centers, across borders, increasing desertification of areas that really is going to, again, lead to those population movements that really have profound political, economic, geostrategic implications. What we're experiencing right now in terms of the energy crisis, thankfully oil prices have come down, but given the concerns about energy reliability, that some of these steps that were in place to try to address carbon emissions and climate change are being pushed into the background. And I do think it's the proverbial frog in the pot of boiling water. It's going to continue to get hotter and hotter and hotter, literally and figuratively. And I do not believe we have the policies, either in individual countries or collectively, globally, to be able to address what I think is going to be an increasing challenge over time. And then in the digital environment, during my career, I witnessed personally the profound changes in how we communicate, how we interact, and that digital domain is the venue for most human activity at this time across all different sectors and domains. And so it is a tremendous engine of prosperity and continued growth and advancement of the human condition, but there are just so many potential challenges that we face there. And when I think about quantum computing and what that's going to do to encryption and how that's going to, I think, radically and profoundly change some of the things that we do, the technological revolutions that continue to take place concern me. And then related to that digital environment, what we see happening right now in the social media with Twitter, the issue of what is the appropriate role of government to try to govern, if appropriate, what happens in that digital domain, given that the digital domain is owned and operated 90% or so by the private sector. What is the role of the government in monitoring and uncovering things in that environment, and in terms of freedom of speech and privacy and security? And these are the real fundamental challenges, I think, of the 21st century, that while we're mired in the challenges that are in our inbox of the day, and I don't want to understate the significance of Russia, Ukraine, and China, but some of these more almost transformational developments in that global environment that our children and grandchildren are going to be experiencing and having to deal with. I think these are the issues that we as a global community really need to take stock of and try to work in a more cooperative way. And maybe I'm being idealistic and naive here, but I do believe that there is a need for that type of work together.
How concerned are you? We've been talking over the course of this conversation for the most part about people like Putin, Xi Jinping, President Biden, Ayatollah Khamenei. How concerned are you about the rise of, and this speaks to the technology issues, technology and the concentration of extreme wealth in terms of super empowered individuals who take on almost state-like power in a sense. So much is being made of the Twitter situation because it's unfolding in real time in front of us. But there's another perhaps lesser reported story that pertains to Elon Musk as well, which is his control over the Starlink system. And he has given or donated or deployed Starlink into Ukraine. That's helped Ukrainian people and Ukrainian military forces continue to communicate. But he has suggested that Russia and Ukraine need to come to the negotiating table, and Ukraine's going to have to give up territory. And in order to kind of achieve that for peace and saving lives, he might turn off elements of the Starlink in certain places to influence facts on the ground. That seems to be an individual inserting themselves into a state-on-state war in a way that's sort of unprecedented. And how concerned are you about that, or is he just sort of a sui generis character that isn't really replicated anywhere else?
Well, although Elon Musk certainly is sui generis in terms of who he is and what he has done, I don't think it's a solitary sort of phenomenon. Because to point out, people with tremendous wealth, tremendous capability, have the potential to really be quite disruptive and to shape the course of events and developments. And Elon Musk certainly has done a significant amount of that already. But then it comes to the issue about, well, we want to make sure, particularly in liberal democratic societies, that we're not going to be stifling that type of entrepreneurship and innovation and independence in many respects. At the same time, when it is disruptive, when it does have a broader impact on societies and can be harmful, at what point does the government, step in, and how does it do that? And I think that's one of the great features of democracy, is that you don't want ever to have one person having this inordinate amount of power. And when I look at some of Elon Musk's tweets when he's doing a poll of his followers about what the outcome should be, about whether to put some of those suspended Twitter accounts back or whatever, it provides a very skewed perspective of what, I guess, not only what the reality is, but what a broader societal interests are. So I am concerned, particularly given that there is a handful of individuals now who have untold wealth and also believe very strongly in the righteousness of their views, and are going to put their imprint on society in a manner that is separate from any type of democratic system and values. So it's again, it's the type of challenge that's when I look out over the next several decades, especially liberal democracies are going to be, I think, quite frustrated in terms of how they continue to advocate, cherish those values that underpin democratic systems, but at the same time do not let individuals with individual agendas that may in fact be antithetical, not just to democratic values, but also the welfare of society. How do you address that? And I don't have an answer to it, but I know it's a looming issue and challenge.
So, an ever-growing number of surveys that have done of corporate leaders and CEOs and boards and the like continue to show that geopolitical risk continues to rise in terms of the perceived risks to businesses that these leaders see. So, as you have pivoted, out of government service into advising a lot of companies, and you kind of look at how these leaders look at these risks, some of which we've been talking about, and then many which are obviously more specific to them and the industry and the business that they're in and what their footprint is. But as you get to know these people more, do you think that corporate America is taking the right approach? Are they well equipped to both analyze and therefore navigate through these risks? Are you comforted by the level of sophistication, or do you say, wow, there's a lot more work that needs to be done here because this stuff is only going to get more complex and compound upon each other?
Well, I think it really runs the spectrum. In the companies that I have dealt with and interacted with, I have found that there are some that really understand the importance and the need to take a broader perspective on where their future lies and what are the factors that will influence their success or in their failure. And there are companies that are a bit isolated in terms of their perspective. To me, and it was something that I very much advocated when I was in government, you need to have individuals at the senior levels of your organization that are able to have a broader perspective on what's happening in the world. Sometimes individuals are just so focused on their sector or their industry, and they're very narrowly focused that they don't take into account these broader changes that are taking place that again are in that what I refer to as the ecosystem, and how their market is being affected by these broader changes and developments. And so I do think that, so I've met some CEOs and C-suites that have a real focus on their business, but at the same time they take that step back and they look at those again broader market developments, how technology is affecting what they do. Just because again something worked in the past 10 years doesn't mean it's going to work in the future. That they need to take into account these changes that are taking place and how they need to again adapt. To me, it's adaptability, and you need to make sure that you don't have either rigid structures or rigid approaches to issues. Need to be open to adjustments, to be able to tack in certain areas because things are happening. And again, having this broader appreciation of the world and these again developments, changes, I think it allows one to again be able to make adjustments in their organizations in order to deal with those changes.
In a way, we had a real world test of this earlier this year, and actually stretching back into around this time last year, right? Which was that the U.S. government, the administration, and the intelligence community, sort of to an unprecedented degree, declassified intelligence to allies and adversaries alike, but also to corporate America, to say, hey, listen, our analysis is that this is going to happen. Russia is going to invade Ukraine, so get ready. And it shocked me, therefore, to a certain degree, on February 24th, that things went like this. There were companies, like you suggest, who had listened prepared their people, prepared their operations in Ukraine and in Russia and elsewhere around the world, and had an immediate action plan of how they were going to deal with it. Others, on the other hand, seemed still surprised. And so either they didn't listen, or they didn't believe, or they didn't know what to do in the wake of what the US government was telling them. So I guess the question is, why did that happen? Number one, and number two, as you look back on that policy decision that was, I believe, advocated by Director Burns and by Director Haynes to the president, was that good policy? Was that effective? And should that be a template going forward in how the U.S. government can interact with corporate America? Considering that corporate America on the China front, on the digital technology front, and the like, is on the front lines of all of these challenges that we face as a country.
Well, I think the intelligence community and administrations over the past number of years have tried to be more forthcoming as far as what the intelligence and analysis say about the future course of events. Sometimes it's right, sometimes it's wrong. We shared intelligence about Saddam Hussein back in 2003 that proved to be wrong. So I can understand that there is some skepticism there. But again, I think at the same time, whether your companies or governments, even if you believe that there is a 1 in 10 chance of something happening, 1 in 10 chance is not all that out of the realm of possibility. And so you need to be thinking through the various scenarios, and that you're able to then react to some of those unanticipated developments and have your contingency plans in place and know what you're going to do. You can't anticipate all of the different scenarios that are in the realm of the possible. But I think what you can do is to say, well, in the unlikely event this happens, this is how we're going to approach the issue or deal with it. And I think disregarding the potential for these very disruptive and unanticipated events can be very, very damaging to one's ability to be able to react. I mean, nobody anticipated the COVID, pandemic, but yet there should have been, I think, plans in place in a lot of companies about what will we do if there's going to be some type of unknown major disruption in terms of global supply chains or other types of things. How are we going to then revert or take steps that are going to mitigate the damage and the effects of that disruption? And if you're not anticipating any of that at all, you're not going to be able to deal with it at the time. You need to give some forethought to these issues.
I wanted to ask you one last question because our time is up. But if you'll indulge me for one moment, you, as I mentioned when I was going through your biography, spent a great deal of your career at CIA devoted toward combating terrorism. And with all of the challenges we're experiencing in the world right now, one of the things that's kind of gotten relegated to the back pages is global terrorism. From the likes of the Al Qaeda's and ISIS of the world and others, more focused, if anything, actually on domestic terrorism. But give us a sense of the state of these organizations and the threat that they currently pose to the U.S., its allies, and its assets distributed around the world.
Well, I think over the past 20 plus years since 9/11, there has been tremendous work done to decimate Al Qaeda, Islamic State, and others because of increased and enhanced international cooperation on these fronts, intelligence sharing and other things. That said, you still have some of these core ideological groups that are burrowed in different countries. Al Qaeda still exists in a variety of countries. You have a variety of domestic terrorist groups that have domestic agendas, but that's what happened with the Islamic State that then decided to go beyond. So although I think the threat of terrorist attacks from these groups has lessened significantly because of the work that has been done, I think their ability to regenerate, and I am concerned what's going on inside of Afghanistan, PAC area, might this lead to a future incubation of a terrorist organization that has a international agenda and an anti-US agenda. It does take some time to develop that. We saw it happening with Al-Qaeda over the course of a number of years until they were able to carry out those attacks. So I think we cannot ignore it, and we need to continue to nurture those relationships internationally among intelligence, security services, and governments to try to ensure that the appropriate steps are taken to not only mitigate the threat, but also to be able to uncover any of these plans as they move down the operational timeline.
Well, John Brennan, I want to thank you so much for your time today. If there's a silver lining to everything you just said, it's that we're going to have plenty of subject matter to discuss on this series next year as we continue. But I want to thank you for your time and your insights today on a broad range of issues and what corporate America ought to be thinking about right now. So thank you again for your time. Thank everybody for joining today. Until next time, I'm Kevin Kajiwara in New York. Have a great day.